Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what seems like the inevitable election of that shameless race grifter, come recent migrant socialist hustler, what's his face, Mamdani, to be the mayor of New York City. So. Now, it's not surprising in a lot of ways. New York's been sort of a magnet for, all sorts of chances and grifters and illegals and hustlers and so on from all over the world. So they flock to New York. So it's hardly surprising that, I think about a third of the population either doesn't speak English, and as much as half the population only speaks English to sort of early, say to the capability of a 6 or 7 year old. So it's maybe not surprising they're voting for it, as they would see it, a religious and racial outsider who promises lots of free stuff. So I guess it's not a surprise. Should someone like that be standing for public office in the United States? Well, in my view, public office should be confined to those who were born in the United States and who have lineage. Now, when the determination of who could stand for public office was first made, in the early days of the Declaration of the Republic, more than half the population were from overseas, came from Britain and, I don't know, the British Isles generally, but other West European Christian places like parts of Germany and Norway and things like that. So when that who could stand for political office, they couldn't very well back in the day, eliminate people that had arrived. So they said, okay, to be the president, you got to be born in the United States. Every other office, as long as you're a naturalized citizen. Now that too functioned fairly well because the bar for becoming a citizen was pretty high, or certainly compared to what it is today. So the bar is now much lower. In addition to that, the people that were coming in those days were, all white Christian, who came from societies where there was democracy and the rule of law and due legal process, independent courts, all of the things that are the building blocks of Western society. So it's very easy for those people to slot into another society that has the same values and social structures. But things are very different today. So people that are coming to the West hate, openly and viciously hate the West, spend all their time condemning it and denouncing it, but always wanting to flock to the West, and again, just for the free stuff. And they don't come from the same sort of societies, and they don't have the same kinship in general, whether it be through Christianity or through West European social traditions and customs and habits. So there's never been a greater need than today to rejig that and say, look, if you want to stand for office, public elected office in the United States, or in my view, anywhere in the Western world, you should be born in the country, born in the United States, for example, and you should have at least one parent born in the United States, one grandparent or one great-grandparent. That's my view, of course. So you have to demonstrate lineage and loyalty to the country, and you're wanting to serve the people of that country, not to serve some race grifting sectional interests, as I would argue Mamdani is. Anyway, what the main thing I want to do here was look at the policies he's putting forward. Now, there's a lot of people saying that these are just straight communist socialist policies, and they're doomed to fail. They'll cause a lot of pain and suffering in New York in the overall scheme of things. They won't really achieve anything. Even their intended objectives will be unachievable. They're all just starry-eyed leftist, dreaming, and they can't be brought into practical reality. And the convulsions required to be gone through, and then still find it's not all working. Why go through that sort of pain and suffering when we already know from the outset it's not going to work? So let's have a look at some of Mamdani's policies. Now, the first one is that he wants to put in rent controls. He says quite reasonably and accurately that rents are going through the roof, and that something needs to be done about that. Okay, well, I think everyone can agree with that. If you look at the explosion of mass migration in the West, and then if you plot it on a chart, you look at when the mass migration began to kick off, rents began to increase in rough proportion to the amount of mass migration. So the issue here is the mass migration. Without that, the rents wouldn't be going out of control. But Mamdani and the people around him, and many others, by the way, Mamdani's not alone in this one. A lot of the leftist, femi communists studying sociology and gender studies, they take reasonably similar sort of positions on this. That the reason prices are increasing is, well, one, there's an insufficient amount of new housing being built, and that it's property speculators that are making the big bucks. And if rents are frozen, then property speculators can't make the money, can't make their profits, and therefore that's a good thing. Now, on the other side is that, well, if there's then a lower incentive to build property because the big profits aren't there on the rental market, then the idea that Mamdani has is they'll build lots of social housing, and that'll fix the problem. Social housing at taxpayer expense. So let's have a look at those two things. And now I've got some sympathy with this, because in the rental market, property flipping of apartments and property generally, property flipping, particularly apartments, but property flipping generally is something the speculators are doing. Now, the speculators certainly that I've seen tend to be people with already who have money, and they're not, instead of doing productive work or investing in a productive business that employs people, they just sink their money into property flipping, and then rely on the mass migration to just artificially push up the prices, push up the rents, and so they can continually flip their properties at a good profit, because as rents are going up, people are prepared to pay more for the investment property because they can recoup a proportion of that in rents. So this, it creates, if you like, a vicious cycle where because rents go up, flipping a property becomes more profitable. So then the property flips, which then pushes the rent up again because the person's paid more for it. The buyer's paid more for it, and then that increases the rent, which then increases the property. So it's a vicious cycle. And given that politicians, certainly in Australia and elsewhere, now derive more than half their income from property speculation, no one in the political class really wants to put an end to that, because that's now 50-60% or more of their income. So whereas before the mass migration, a politician's income was their parliamentary or their congressional income, but now that's all changed. There'd be very few politicians that make their money from, or where their income is primarily or absolutely from salaries. It's now from property speculation. So, and I'll just illustrate two things here. Coming back to man, I got some sympathy for. I don't think Mamdani's going to go about it the right way, but I have some sympathy with the concept. So down the road, there's some folks renting a property that I think it was built in the 1970s originally. The family that owned it, then it's passed on to other members of the family, and they've kept it. But I think the property's like $15,000 or something in the 1970s. It's now somewhere around $1.5 million. In again, pushed up by insane levels of mass migration. But and if you look at the property price appreciation, say 1950 to 1975, that 25 years, then you look at 1975 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2025, the acceleration in property appreciation just went off the scales. So a property that sold for $25,000 in 1970 could sell for over $4 million today. That's the level of insanity there, and that's a level of price appreciation that has never occurred in certainly in history, to my knowledge. So we're in very interesting times here in terms of property appreciation, price appreciation, and rents. Now, that place that the family still owns, that the original buying family still owns, they're asking rent, and the folks that are in renting that place have been there for years. I don't know, 15 years, something like that. And so the rent that they pay is less than a half, probably around 40%, 35 to 40% of what the market rate is. And because these people own the house, and because the owners own the house and have done for quite some, they don't have mortgages to pay off or anything like that. And given the costs they have in terms of maintenance and insurance and rates and so on, they can afford to rent that place for 40% or less of the current market rate, because it doesn't owe them anything. They don't have to pay out anything on mortgage payments and other service type payments related to the mortgage. But as soon as they sell that place, and at some point they're going to, but as soon as they sell that place, then the rent is going to have to close to triple, because whoever buys it is going to pay market price, purchase price for the house, and then they're going to need to offset the payments they have to make on that. So the flipping of real estate is very much the churning of real estate is very much a major component of rent increases. Whoever buys the property has to pay the current market rate, and to pay the current market rate means they have to go to the top end of the rental market rate. Now, there's a lot of organisations around Australia and elsewhere around the world that are sending out weekly or fortnightly or monthly messages, emails and so on, saying, hey, you can put the rent up by another $5 a week. Our assessment says that the property is worth more, and so on. So there's a constant hum, a constant, frantic driving all the time in property owners saying, you can get a bit more, you can get another $1 more, which sort of creates a natural momentum of rent increases, because this then feeds back into the property speculation of, because I can get such a high rent, I can therefore afford to buy that property. So it's a scam, I think, and it's going all over the Western world at the moment. Now, coming to the issue of rents, if property owners who want, this is in an investment property where people are renting, they should be, I believe, prevented from selling at market rate. If they want to sell a house, they can't sell it at a market rate, and then keep it on in the rental market. If they want to sell it and it's a place for people to live in, a family to live in, that's different. But if it's going to be kept as a rental property, then I don't believe these things should be flipped at full market rate, because that creates momentum in inflation, and it's paid for by the people with the least ability to pay for. And just to illustrate this, that just in Sydney, for example, renting an ordinary apartment in say 1975 would take up just a little bit less than 20%. Say 18%, 19% of the average wage. Now, today, that same property in rent would consume 65% of the average wage. So that just illustrates the difference. So how that's addressed, because I believe it's a social problem of the first order and causing a massive wealth transfer away from working class and middle class people, that should be addressed. And Mamdani's view of freezing rents, if it's done properly and done selectively and done carefully, I think it could work. And I'm certainly no communist, but that's something that frantic price increasing and the industry upon industry dedicated to with great energy and application of forcing up prices of property and rents and so on. I think that should be short-circuited. Whether Mamdani, when you get into the details and the weeds of the details, can solve that or go some way to slowing it down even, then I think that would be a good thing. So I think that intention and that outcome is good. Whether they go about it in the right, because just putting a blanket ban on rent increases, depending, without realization of situation and circumstances and the debt that's owed. For example, someone that bought a property yesterday at full top end market price, putting a rent freeze on them and at the same time hitting them with higher taxes, that's going to result in a negative outcome. So it needs to be looked at, I think, carefully. But I think that's workable. But the idea of how can we stop these hysterical breakneck rent increases and property price increases, stop mass migration. Let's assume that stays, then some sort of controls on rent increases, I think, are desirable. Or property price increases generally, mortgage prices. So now Mamdani's got another few things that people will be able to travel on the bus for free. Well, I don't know if it's a bus and train. I think it was just buses. Now, this is something where, okay, you do that. So, all right, free traveling on the bus. And for people at the, on the lowest wages, the bottom end, that's fine. Okay, that would be a help to their budgets. Some of them live in the lower price rent areas, and they've got quite a long way to travel into the city, maybe to do their shitty low paid job. So the travel can take up can take up 15%, 10 to 15% of their weekly wage can just be chewed up in traveling. And the train lines don't go everywhere around New York, so the bus lines are covering some of these, again, sort of poorer areas. Okay, so just on the face of it, having these people travel for free, all right, I understand that would be a help with their budgets and so on. But once you deny them tens of millions of dollars every week, where does that money come from? Because the bus driver still needs to be paid. The bus still has to be maintained. It still has to have fuel and oil or whatever. It's still going to need tires and there still needs to be depots where the bus can go to get serviced and maintained. Those mechanics and other people have to, they have to be paid. So there's a whole lot of just ambient, miasma level costs that are associated with keeping buses on the road and making sure they're reliable. I've noticed wherever there's been cost cutbacks, certainly in parts of Australia, and attempts to skimp on transport, that very quickly you see a lot of broken down buses on the road, and so you see the effects of this straight away because maintenance is expensive. So the company, bus company, just cuts back on the maintenance, and the result is that more buses break down, the service becomes more unreliable. So these people can't get to work on time, and these sorts of things. So coming on the buses, but the primary concern of the buses is still cost money to keep them on the road and running. And if you don't recoup some or all of that in the bus fares you charge, then in the bus fares people pay, then you have to then just tax other people for it. So it's still not going to be free. You just move the problem around. So that's not really a solution in my view. The next thing Mamdani was talking about, saying, well, buses take a long time to get around. Well, again, we've got a mass migration issue here. There are a lot of people, a lot of freeloaders of that in New York these days that don't speak English. And I see the effects of that sometimes in public transport, with a lot of people running around. They barely speak a word of English. And it's not easy for them to get around. They're not tourists. Some of them have been in Australia for 10 or 15 years and they still don't fucking speak a word of English. So this idea of buses taking a long time to get around. Also, I took a bus just recently. I noticed how many recent migrants who then don't speak a word of English, often in Islamic garb, by the way, and they've got multiple physically handicapped relatives. So when they get on the bus, it can be a 10-minute gig just getting them on the fucking bus. So buses are taking a long time to get around, traffic congestion, the type of people that are using the bus and so on. And so, as I understand it, Mamdani's proposal is to create more bus lanes and to limit the amount of non-public traffic. So, instead of there being 2 lanes for private vehicles, there'll be 1 lane, and these other lanes will be given to buses and so on. Now, I do get that. It's okay. I understand that would speed up, the movement of public transport, in this case, buses. But it's going to, again, it's just moving the problem around. The problem needs to be, you've got too many people, you've got to widen the roads, create more lanes on the roads. You want to have more social housing and more housing to house the mass migrants, then create wider roads. But no, that's not going to be done. Instead, we're going to limit, so again, Mamdani's policy, we're going to limit private traffic and so that public traffic can be increased and its movement can be freed up, so it's going to get from point A to point B more quickly. Let's suppose that happens and private traffic is choked to the point where if you've got a private vehicle, you can't get anywhere because it's just too congested because there's fewer lanes. Then people are going to say, okay, well, I'll take public transport then. So then you get a situation where millions of people start to move to public transport. Then you have to get more buses, more drivers, more maintenance, and so on. And therefore, and given no one's paying for it, then you're going to have to increase taxes to achieve that, to put the extra buses with extra personnel and so on the road. So extra workers doing the grunt work. So again, you're just moving a problem around. Now, another thing that Mamdani is talking about is reducing grocery prices. Now, the truth is that since COVID and around the time COVID's kicking off, grocery prices just generally have increased by about 25%. In some categories, even more than that. The primer cuts of beef and so on. But prices have increased quite considerably, even at the base level stuff like bread and milk and so on. Now, why is that? Is it that just because of COVID, suddenly the cost of everything went up? Well, I don't buy that. I just don't believe that. So the claims going around at times are we can't get drivers for the trucks and we can't, there's not enough workers to do the work. All of this was bullshit, by the way. The extra money just went into profits, but whether it be the food manufacturers, which are effectively now are owned by a small group of multinationals, even in things like milk production. Milk production used to be a lot of private dairy farms around Australia. Now it's just effectively a small, just a group again of multinationals. That own the milk production, but the price of milk has gone through the roof since those guys took the milk production over. So we're looking at a very different financial landscape, and in addition to that, in the grocery store chains. Now the grocery store chains are effectively oligopolies. Someone with an IQ of minus 10 million could turn a profit on these grocery store chains. Running them, the CEO, and the top brass at these grocery store chains are paid gazillions. The money they pay on consultants and the real estate property speculation within these grocery store chains, gazillions is wasted on this sort of thing. Some of these grocery store CEOs are paid like $10 million a year for what? It's a fucking oligopoly, for Christ's sakes. So it's just a highly paid, prestigious daycare, gig for the socially well connected and so on. So there's a lot of huge amount of fat in the overall food production, distribution, and so on. and that could be cut. Now, again, if you go down the straight socialist path there, it doesn't really work. And again, it would be moving the problem around rather than solving it. But there could be a root and branch examination of, the costing, the entire costing process of delivering, well-priced, competitively priced groceries to the public. And I think if that's done, prices would come down substantially, in my view. And so that's something that could be attempted. Socialists go about it the wrong way generally, and they tend to refute market forces, thinking that's the epicenter of their consideration. So I think they'd fuck that up. But that's something that I think strides could be made if it was done carefully and with a realization of market competition. And I think that there's no way that a CEO of a grocery store chain, an oligopoly, should be paid $10 million a year. I mean, what a fucking joke. Or that the various offsiders around them would be paid multi-million dollar salaries. I know one of the guys who is on a $2 million a year salary, and he's one of the senior guys in one of the grocery chains. And I mean, he's an unimpressive guy. I mean, he's got this sort of little wide-eyed little boy thing, little bum boy sort of look. But gee, you wouldn't get him to sweep the floor or run a bath, let alone a company. And he's on a $2 million a year salary. He's just part of a sort of a cheer squad for the CEO, the court jester of the aristocrats of old and so on. But just coming on Mamdani's thing, I doubt it'll work, and he's not coming in as a dictator. There are still many councillors on the New York City Council. They may not agree with some or all of what he wants to do, so he's going to have to compromise and accept that he's just not going to get the whole process. But there are areas where he could make progress if he does it properly. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.